At least we won't have to support her now, my daughter-in-law whispered at my husband's funeral, thinking I was too far away to hear. I heard every word. I just didn't react. The autumn wind moved gently through the cemetery as people gathered beneath a gray October sky. Fresh flowers surrounded Robert's casket, their scent mixing with the cool air. We'd been married for 42 years. 42 years of shared mornings, family vacations, mortgage payments, and quiet evenings on our back porch watching the sun disappear behind the trees. Now I stood alone in a black dress, accepting condolences from people who spoke in soft voices and careful phrases. My name is Margaret Whitmore. I was 71 years old, and 3 days earlier, I had lost the man who had been the center of my world. Grief sat heavily on my shoulders, making every movement feel slower than it should have. Yet somehow, my pain wasn't the most surprising thing I experienced that day. It was the way people looked at me, the way conversations stopped when I approached, the way certain relatives exchanged glances before offering forced smiles. Robert had been successful for most of his life. He owned several commercial properties, invested wisely, and built a comfortable future for our family. But after his illness, rumors began spreading. Medical bills, business losses, financial strain. I never corrected anyone. Neither did Robert. We simply let people believe whatever they wanted. Standing near the graveside, I noticed Vanessa speaking quietly with my son Ethan. She wasn't crying. In fact, she seemed unusually energized for someone attending a funeral. Every few minutes, she glanced toward me before continuing her conversation. Ethan nodded repeatedly. At one point, Vanessa placed a hand on his arm and smiled. It wasn't a comforting smile. It looked more like anticipation. Later, during the reception at the church fellowship hall, I sat alone at a round table near the window. The room was filled with casseroles, coffee urns, and the low hum of conversation. Friends shared stories about Robert. Former colleagues talked about his generosity. Neighbors remembered helping him shovel snow during difficult winters. For a while, I allowed myself to focus on those memories. Then I overheard Vanessa again. She stood only a few feet away speaking with one of her friends. "Margaret will probably need to sell the house," she said casually. "It's way too much for her now." Her friend frowned sympathetically. "That's unfortunate." Vanessa shrugged. "Honestly, it's probably for the best. She can't maintain that place forever." I lowered my eyes to my untouched cup of coffee. The house she was discussing wasn't just property. Robert and I bought it when Ethan was 6 years old. We painted every room ourselves. We planted every tree in the yard. We celebrated birthdays, graduations, anniversaries, and holidays there. Yet Vanessa spoke about it as if it were already available for reassignment. A few minutes later, another comment drifted across the room. "At least Ethan won't have to carry her financially." I recognized the voice immediately. Vanessa again. I almost smiled at the irony. People around her nodded. Some looked genuinely concerned. Others appeared relieved. Apparently, a quiet widow was easier to discuss than a living person sitting 20 feet away. Still, I said nothing. I simply listened. By the end of the afternoon, I had learned more about my family's assumptions than I had in years. They believed I was vulnerable. They believed I was dependent. Most of all, they believed I was broke. As the reception wound down, guests began leaving. Chairs scraped across the floor. Empty coffee cups disappeared into trash bins. Through the large windows, I watched the sun begin its slow descent. That's when I noticed Vanessa speaking to a man in a navy suit near the entrance. Robert's attorney, Charles Bennett. She leaned closer and asked a question that made my stomach tighten. "How soon can everything be transferred?" Charles didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked across the room directly at me. His expression changed. Not surprise, not sympathy, something closer to curiosity. Then he glanced back at Vanessa and simply said, "Some things aren't always what they seem." Vanessa frowned. I looked away before either of them noticed I was watching. At that moment, I remembered the sealed envelope Robert had given me 2 weeks before he died. An envelope sitting untouched inside my dresser drawer. An envelope he instructed me not to open until after the funeral. And for the first time that day, despite my grief, I felt something else stirring beneath the sadness. Not anger, not fear, anticipation. That evening, the house felt larger than it had ever felt before. The silence settled into every corner, every hallway, every room Robert and I had shared for decades. I unlocked the front door, stepped inside, and automatically reached for the light switch beside the entryway. For a moment, I expected to hear his voice from the living room asking how everything went. Instead, there was only stillness. I placed my purse on the console table and removed my black heels. My feet ached after standing for hours, but the physical discomfort barely registered. My mind kept returning to the conversations I had overheard throughout the day. Vanessa discussing my future as though I were not present. Ethan standing beside her without objection. Relatives speculating about my finances. Friends of the family offering sympathy that felt suspiciously close to pity. I moved slowly through the house, turning on lamps one by one. The warm glow illuminated familiar objects that suddenly seemed different without Robert beside me. His reading glasses still rested on the end table. His favorite coffee mug sat beside the sink. A navy sweater remained folded neatly over the arm of his recliner. 42 years of marriage had filled this house with memories. Now every room seemed to hold its breath. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table. Outside the window, the backyard looked peaceful beneath the fading evening light. The maple tree Robert planted when Ethan graduated from high school stood tall near the fence. He used to joke that the tree would outlive all of us. Back then, neither of us imagined how quickly life could change. As I stared into my tea, I thought about Ethan. Losing a father was difficult at any age. Part of me wanted to excuse his behavior as grief. I wanted to believe he was overwhelmed and vulnerable. But the image of him nodding while Vanessa discussed selling my home refused to leave my mind. He was not a frightened child anymore. He was a 44-year-old man making choices. And each choice seemed to place him a little farther away from me. Around 8 o'clock, my phone rang. Ethan's name appeared on the screen. I answered after the second ring. His voice sounded unusually cheerful. He asked how I was doing. He asked whether I had eaten dinner. He asked whether I needed anything from the grocery store. The concern sounded rehearsed, artificial. Then the real reason for the call emerged. Vanessa thought it might be a good idea to start discussing practical matters soon. The house, future expenses, long-term plans. I listened quietly while he spoke. He framed everything as concern, everything as responsibility, everything as helping me adjust. When he finally paused, I simply told him I was tired and needed some rest. He accepted that answer surprisingly quickly. After we hung up, I remained seated at the table for a long time. The conversation had confirmed something I had been reluctant to admit. They already had a plan. The funeral was over. Their attention had shifted. Not toward healing. Not toward family. Toward assets. Toward decisions. Toward opportunities. Eventually, I carried my empty cup upstairs. The master bedroom felt colder than usual. I changed into comfortable clothes and opened the top drawer of my dresser. The envelope sat exactly where Robert had left it. Thick, cream-colored, completely sealed. I picked it up carefully. My name was written across the front in his familiar handwriting. Seeing those letters made my chest tighten. I remembered the afternoon he handed it to me in the hospital. His voice had been calm, firm. He made me promise not to open it until after the funeral. At the time, I assumed it contained personal instructions or final thoughts he wanted me to read privately. Now I was no longer certain. Charles Bennett's strange expression returned to my mind. So did his words. Some things are not always what they seem. I turned the envelope over in my hands. For a few seconds, I considered opening it. Immediately. Instead, I placed it on the nightstand beside the bed. Robert had asked me to wait. And after 42 years together, I trusted him enough to believe there was a reason. As I turned off the lamp and settled beneath the covers, one thought lingered in the darkness. Everyone seemed convinced they understood my future. The truth was, they might not understand it at all. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. For years, that had been Robert's habit, not mine. He always claimed the quietest hour of the day belonged to people who paid attention. Lying there in the dim light, I found myself thinking about that sealed envelope again. It sat exactly where I had left it on the nightstand. Untouched. Waiting. I dressed slowly and made breakfast, though I barely ate. The kitchen felt unfamiliar without the sound of Robert reading the newspaper across from me. Every routine now carried a small ache. After cleaning my plate, I decided to take a walk through the neighborhood. The air was cool, and the sidewalks were scattered with fallen leaves. Several neighbors waved as I passed. A few stopped to offer condolences. Their kindness felt genuine, and for a little while, it eased the heaviness I had been carrying. But the peace did not last long. As I turned onto my street, I noticed a black luxury sport utility vehicle parked in my driveway. My pace slowed immediately. I recognized the vehicle. Vanessa. Beside it sat another car I had never seen before. A silver sedan with a real estate company logo displayed on the door. For several seconds, I simply stood there staring. Then I walked toward the house. As I approached, I noticed 3 people standing near my front porch. Vanessa, Ethan, and a man holding a clipboard. None of them had seen me yet. The man was looking at the exterior of the house, while Vanessa pointed toward the roof and the landscaping. Ethan stood nearby with his hands in his pockets. They looked comfortable, familiar, almost as though they belonged there. I stopped behind a large maple tree near the edge of the property and listened. The location alone is worth a fortune, the man said. Vanessa smiled. That is exactly what I keep telling him. She nodded toward Ethan. My son laughed softly. Mom is going to resist at first, but she will come around. Eventually, she will realize it is too much house for one person. The words settled heavily in my chest. Not because they surprised me, because they confirmed what I already suspected. They were not discussing possibilities. They were discussing plans. Plans that somehow did not require my participation. I remained where I was for another minute. Then I stepped forward. Ethan saw me first. The color drained from his face. Vanessa turned around immediately. Her smile appeared a second later, quick and practiced. Margaret, she said brightly. We were just talking about property values in the neighborhood. The real estate agent extended his hand. I ignored it. Instead, I looked directly at my son. Interesting conversation for a Tuesday morning. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. It is not what it looks like. I almost laughed at how predictable that sentence sounded. Then what does it look like? Neither of them answered. The silence stretched between us. Finally, the agent cleared his throat and excused himself. Within moments, he was back in his car. Vanessa watched him leave before turning back to me. We are only trying to help. Help. That word seemed to appear every time someone wanted control over a decision that belonged to someone else. I nodded politely and walked past them into the house. Neither followed me. Through the front window, I watched them continue talking in the driveway for several minutes before eventually driving away. Once they were gone, I sat alone in the living room. Sunlight streamed through the curtains Robert had picked out nearly 20 years earlier. My eyes drifted toward the staircase, then toward the hallway, then toward the bedroom upstairs where the envelope waited. For the first time since the funeral, I felt certain about one thing. Whatever Robert had left inside that envelope was important. Important enough that he trusted it to remain unopened until exactly the right moment. And judging by what I had just witnessed in my own driveway, that moment was getting closer every day. The following afternoon, I finally called Charles Bennett. The moment he answered, I could hear a subtle shift in his tone, as though he had been expecting my call. He asked how I was holding up, and I gave the same answer I had given everyone else. I told him I was managing. The truth was more complicated. Grief came in waves. Some moments felt almost normal. Others arrived without warning and left me staring at an empty chair or an old photograph for far longer than I intended. Charles listened quietly before asking if I would be available to meet the next day. His request surprised me. Usually, legal matters moved slowly after a death. There were documents to process, accounts to review, formal procedures to follow. Yet something in his voice suggested urgency. Not panic, not concern, purpose. We agreed to meet at his office the following morning. After ending the call, I walked through the house again. It had become a habit over the past few days. Room by room, memory by memory. In the den, I found one of Robert's notebooks resting on a shelf beside his desk. He had always written things down. Ideas, reminders, goals. The notebook was filled with neat handwriting, page after page of observations and plans. As I flipped through it, I came across a sentence underlined twice. People reveal themselves when they think the outcome is already decided. I stared at those words longer than I expected. They felt less like a note and more like a warning, or perhaps a lesson. The next morning, I arrived at Charles's office shortly before 10 o'clock. His assistant greeted me warmly and escorted me into a conference room overlooking downtown. The city skyline stretched across the windows, bright beneath a clear blue sky. Charles entered carrying a folder and a cup of coffee. After offering condolences once again, he sat across from me and folded his hands. For several moments, he simply studied my expression. Finally, he asked a question I did not expect. Have you opened the envelope yet? I shook my head. A faint smile crossed his face. Good. That single word immediately captured my attention. Good. Not necessary. Not understandable. Good. I leaned forward slightly. Charles, what exactly is happening? He glanced toward the closed conference room door before returning his attention to me. Before Robert passed away, he spent nearly 2 years reorganizing certain aspects of his affairs. The statement seemed ordinary at first. Responsible people updated estate plans all the time. But Charles continued. He also anticipated certain reactions after his death. A chill ran through me despite the comfortable temperature of the room. Anticipated. The word echoed in my mind. Robert had always been observant. He noticed things others missed. Small changes in behavior, patterns in conversations, motivations hidden beneath polite words. Charles opened the folder but did not slide any documents toward me. Instead, he said something that immediately brought Vanessa and Ethan to mind. Your husband believed some individuals might make assumptions before they had all the facts. I almost laughed. Assumptions seemed to be exactly what everyone was making. Charles looked directly at me. Margaret, I am going to give you a piece of advice. Do not rush. Do not explain yourself. And do not correct anyone's misunderstandings just yet. The seriousness in his voice caught me off guard. Why? I asked quietly. He closed the folder. Because sometimes the truth becomes much more valuable when people have already shown who they are without it. We sat in silence for several seconds. Then he stood and walked to the window. Looking out over the city, he spoke without turning around. Your husband trusted you completely. He also trusted that you would know when the time was right. On the drive home, I thought about every word Charles had said. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I realized something important. Neither Charles nor Robert seemed surprised by anything that had happened since the funeral. The comments, the assumptions, the sudden interest in my house. It was almost as though they had expected it. And if that was true, then perhaps the envelope waiting upstairs contained far more than memories. 2 days later, Vanessa called and invited me to what she described as a family planning meeting. The phrase alone told me everything I needed to know. Families usually gathered to support one another after a loss. They did not normally hold planning meetings less than a week after a funeral. Still, I agreed to attend. Curiosity had become stronger than hesitation. The gathering took place at Ethan and Vanessa's house on Saturday afternoon. When I arrived, I immediately noticed several unfamiliar faces. Ethan's financial advisor sat at the dining table. Vanessa's brother was there as well. Even a local contractor had been invited. The atmosphere felt less like a family discussion and more like a business presentation. Vanessa greeted me warmly, almost too warmly. She offered coffee, tea, bottled water, and several pastries arranged neatly on the kitchen counter. Her friendliness felt carefully rehearsed. Everyone settled into their seats, and within minutes the conversation shifted exactly where I expected. The house. My house. Vanessa spoke first. She described maintenance costs, property taxes, future repairs. She talked about stairs becoming difficult as people aged. She mentioned how much easier life could be in a smaller place. Ethan nodded throughout her presentation. Occasionally, he added comments about convenience and safety. I listened quietly. Not once did either of them ask what I wanted. Instead, they discussed my future as though it had already been decided. At one point, the financial advisor slid a folder across the table. Inside were estimates for selling the property, market projections, suggested timelines, potential downsizing options. I turned a few pages and then closed the folder without comment. The silence seemed to make everyone uncomfortable. Vanessa eventually smiled and folded her hands. We are only trying to help you make the smartest decision. There was that word again. Help. The contractor began describing possible renovations that could increase the home's resale value. Vanessa appeared particularly interested in that part of the conversation. She asked detailed questions about timing and expected returns. Listening to her, I realized something important. She was no longer imagining possibilities. In her mind, the sale had already happened. She had mentally moved into the future and brought everyone else with her. Everyone except me. As the discussion continued, I noticed Ethan watching my reactions closely. Perhaps he expected resistance. Perhaps he expected tears. Instead, I remained calm. Robert used to say that silence often revealed more than arguments ever could. By the end of the meeting, I had learned far more than they realized. Not one person asked how I was coping. Not one person mentioned Robert's absence. The entire afternoon revolved around property, money, and planning. Eventually, the conversation ended. People gathered their papers and prepared to leave. As I stood near the front door, Vanessa stepped beside me. Her voice dropped slightly. "You know, Margaret, this would make everything easier for everyone." "Everyone. Not you. Not Ethan. Everyone." I smiled politely. "I will think about it." Relief flashed across her face. She clearly interpreted my answer as progress. What she did not understand was that I had made no promises. During the drive home, I found myself thinking about Charles's advice. Do not rush. Do not explain yourself. Let people reveal who they are. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I realized the meeting had accomplished something valuable. The uncertainty was gone. I no longer wondered what Vanessa and Ethan wanted. They had shown me clearly. And as I walked into the quiet house and glanced toward the staircase where the unopened envelope still waited, I had the distinct feeling that Robert had expected this exact moment long before any of us arrived here. 3 nights after the meeting, a heavy rainstorm rolled across the county. Wind rattled the windows, and distant thunder rolled across the dark sky. I sat alone in the living room with a blanket draped over my shoulders, listening to the weather and thinking about everything that had happened since Robert's funeral. The house felt different now, not because Robert was gone. That pain remained constant. It was different because the uncertainty was beginning to disappear. Piece by piece, people were revealing themselves. The assumptions, the plans, the quiet calculations disguised as concern. Around 9 o'clock, I finally stood up and walked upstairs. The envelope was still resting on the nightstand exactly where I had left it. For several seconds, I simply looked at it. My name, written in Robert's careful handwriting, seemed to carry a weight all its own. I sat on the edge of the bed and picked it up. The paper felt slightly worn from the number of times I had held it over the past week. Then, slowly, I opened it. Inside were several documents and a handwritten letter. My heart tightened as soon as I recognized Robert's handwriting. I unfolded the letter first. "Margaret, if you are reading this, then you kept your promise." I smiled despite myself. That sounded exactly like him. The letter continued. He wrote about our life together, about our first apartment, about the years when money was tight and every dollar mattered, about Ethan as a little boy riding his bicycle in the driveway, about the house and everything we had built together. Then the tone changed. "If recent events have unfolded the way I suspect they might, I need you to trust me a little longer." My eyes moved more slowly across the page. Robert explained that over the last 2 years he had quietly restructured nearly every major asset he owned. Properties, investments, business holdings, accounts. He had done it gradually and legally with Charles's assistance. Not because he expected to die, because he wanted to protect what we spent our lives building. At the bottom of the letter, one sentence was underlined. People often show their true character when they believe someone else has become powerless. I lowered the letter and stared into the silence. Suddenly, dozens of recent conversations made more sense. The funeral comments, the property discussions, the pressure to sell the house, the confidence Vanessa displayed every time money entered the conversation. I turned my attention to the remaining documents. Several pages contained legal summaries prepared by Charles. The language was formal, but one fact became immediately clear. The assumptions being made about my situation were wildly inaccurate. Robert had not left confusion behind. He had left structure, deliberate structure. The details were extensive, and some sections required professional explanation. But even I could tell that the reality was very different from what Vanessa and Ethan appeared to believe. I spent nearly 2 hours reading every page. By the time I finished, the storm outside had begun to fade. Rain tapped gently against the windows. The house had grown quiet again. Yet something inside me felt steadier than it had in days. Not because of money, not because of property, because Robert had given me clarity. He had anticipated more than I ever realized. He had seen patterns long before I did. Most importantly, he had trusted me enough to carry out his final wishes exactly as intended. As I carefully returned the documents to the envelope, my phone vibrated on the nightstand. A new message had arrived from Vanessa. She wanted to schedule another family discussion later that week. According to her message, there were several important decisions that needed to be finalized soon. I looked at the screen for a moment and then set the phone aside without replying. For the first time since the funeral, I was no longer wondering what came next. I already knew. The only question remaining was how much longer everyone would continue believing a story that was never true in the first place. The next Thursday, Charles called and informed me that a formal family meeting had been scheduled for the following afternoon at his office. His voice remained calm and professional, but I sensed the significance behind the invitation. Certain documents needed to be reviewed. Certain matters needed to be clarified. When I hung up the phone, I already knew Vanessa would attend. She had been pushing toward this moment from the day of the funeral. The difference was that she believed the meeting would confirm everything she expected. Friday arrived bright and clear. I dressed carefully, choosing a navy blue suit that Robert always liked. Looking at myself in the mirror, I realized I appeared stronger than I had felt only a week earlier. Grief still lived inside me, but confusion no longer did. By the time I reached Charles's office, several people were already waiting. Ethan sat at one side of the conference table. Vanessa sat beside him with a leather portfolio resting on her lap. She looked confident, relaxed, almost excited. When I entered the room, she greeted me warmly. Far more warmly than she had greeted me at the funeral. Ethan stood and pulled out a chair for me. The gesture felt unusual enough to catch my attention. Small changes were beginning to appear. Charles entered carrying several folders. His assistant distributed copies of various documents around the table. The meeting began with routine legal matters. Property records, account summaries, administrative responsibilities. Vanessa listened carefully to every word. Whenever Charles mentioned an asset, I noticed her glance toward Ethan. Occasionally, she made notes in the margin of her papers. Nearly an hour passed before the conversation shifted. Charles opened a different folder and adjusted his glasses. The atmosphere in the room changed almost immediately. Even Ethan seemed to notice. "There is one additional matter that Robert instructed us to address separately," Charles said. Vanessa straightened in her chair. Charles continued reviewing several pages before speaking again. The legal language was complex, but the overall message was becoming increasingly clear. Certain assumptions regarding ownership were incorrect. Certain expectations regarding control were also incorrect. I watched confusion slowly appear across Ethan's face. Vanessa remained silent, though her smile began fading. Charles calmly explained that Robert had completed an extensive restructuring process long before his death. The process affected investments, partnerships, holdings, and multiple categories of assets. Every explanation seemed to create more questions than answers. Finally, Vanessa interrupted. "I am sorry, but who exactly controls all of this now?" The room grew very quiet. Charles looked down at the document in front of him before answering. "Margaret does." Nobody spoke for several seconds. Ethan blinked twice as though he had misheard. Vanessa's expression froze completely. Charles continued speaking, outlining additional details and legal protections that Robert had established. The numbers involved were far larger than anyone at that table appeared to expect. I noticed Ethan's eyes widening with every page. Vanessa no longer took notes. She simply stared at the documents in front of her. Then Charles reached the final summary. He placed the paper on the table and folded his hands. "The current estimated value exceeds $28 million. The silence that followed felt almost unreal. A week earlier, people had discussed retirement communities, downsizing plans, and financial dependence. Now nobody seemed capable of finding the right words. Vanessa was the first to recover. "There must be some mistake." Charles shook his head. "There is no mistake." I remained silent throughout the exchange. Not because I wanted to appear dramatic. Because there was nothing left to explain. The truth had arrived on its own. Every assumption, every whispered conversation, every carefully crafted plan suddenly looked very different under the light of reality. And for the first time since Robert's funeral, I saw genuine uncertainty in Vanessa's eyes. When the meeting finally ended, nobody rushed toward the door. It was as though the room itself had become difficult to leave. Vanessa sat perfectly still, staring at the stack of papers in front of her. Ethan looked equally unsettled. The confidence that had followed them into the conference room was gone. In its place was confusion. Charles gathered his folders quietly and excused himself, leaving the rest of us alone for a few minutes. That was when something remarkable happened. Vanessa smiled. Not the triumphant smile she had worn during the past week. A different smile. Softer, careful, measured. "Margaret," she began, "I think there have been some misunderstandings recently." I almost admired the speed of the transformation. Only days earlier, She had discussed selling my house as though the decision had already been made. Now she was searching for common ground. Ethan cleared his throat. Mom, we were only worried about you. Worried. Another familiar word. I remembered the real estate agent standing in my driveway. I remembered the contractor at the family meeting. I remembered conversations about downsizing, property values, and future plans. Somehow, none of those memories felt connected to concern. Yet I simply nodded. I understand. My calm response seemed to encourage them. Vanessa immediately leaned forward. We all want what is best for the family. There it was. The family. The same family that had spent the previous week making assumptions without asking a single question. The same family that had already begun arranging my future while believing I had no options. I listened politely while they continued talking. Every sentence sounded different now. More cautious, more respectful, more strategic. By the time I left the office, I felt strangely peaceful. Not because of the money, not because of the assets, because uncertainty had finally disappeared. People no longer needed to be guessed at. They had already revealed themselves. Over the next several days, the changes became impossible to ignore. Ethan called every morning. He asked whether I needed groceries. He offered to help with household projects. He even volunteered to mow the lawn, something he had not offered to do in years. Vanessa began sending thoughtful text messages. She checked on me regularly. She invited me to dinner twice in the same week. One afternoon, she even stopped by with homemade cookies. The effort was impressive. Unfortunately, timing has a way of exposing intentions. Had those gestures arrived immediately after the funeral, they might have felt sincere. Arriving after the meeting at Charles's office, they felt different. Not hostile, not malicious, simply transparent. One evening, I sat on the back porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and orange. The old maple tree swayed gently in the breeze. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to think about Robert without also thinking about legal documents and family drama. I thought about his patience, his foresight, his ability to understand people. The sentence from his notebook returned to me. People reveal themselves when they think the outcome is already decided. He had been right. Not because he distrusted people, because he understood human nature. A few days later, Ethan invited me to lunch. During the meal, he spoke carefully, choosing every word with unusual precision. Several times he apologized for making assumptions. Several times he mentioned how much he valued family. I listened quietly. Toward the end of the conversation, he finally asked the question that had clearly been on his mind. Mom, did you know all along? I looked out the restaurant window before answering. Not all along. That was the truth. I had learned the details only recently. But I had learned something far more important during the days before that meeting. Money changes conversations. Character reveals motives. And silence often tells the most honest story of all. Ethan lowered his eyes. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I reached for my coffee cup and took a slow sip. Outside, people continued walking down the sidewalk, completely unaware that an entire family's assumptions had collapsed within the span of a single week. And somehow, I suspected the most important conversation was still ahead of us. Several weeks passed before the final conversation happened. By then, the phone calls had become routine. The invitations, the offers to help, the careful words. Everything felt calmer on the surface. Yet beneath it all lingered a question nobody seemed willing to ask directly. One Sunday afternoon, Ethan and Vanessa came to my house for lunch. The weather was beautiful. Sunlight filled the dining room. And for the first time since Robert's funeral, the house felt warm again. I prepared a simple meal and set the table the way I always had. For a while, we talked about ordinary things. The neighborhood, work, upcoming holidays, safe topics, comfortable topics. Eventually, however, the conversation slowed. Silence settled over the table. Ethan looked at Vanessa. Vanessa looked at her coffee cup. Finally, my son spoke. Mom, I owe you an apology. The words hung in the air between us. He was not looking at the table anymore. He was looking directly at me. I should have been thinking about what you were going through instead of trying to solve problems that were not mine to solve. I listened quietly. He continued speaking. He admitted that he had made assumptions. He admitted that he had allowed other voices to influence his judgment. Most importantly, he admitted that he had stopped seeing me as a person who could make her own decisions. Vanessa remained silent until he finished. Then she spoke as well. Her apology was different, more careful, more measured. She acknowledged that she had overstepped. She acknowledged that she had focused too heavily on practical matters immediately after Robert's death. Whether every word came from genuine reflection or lingering embarrassment no longer mattered as much as it once would have. I had spent weeks waiting for clarity. Now I finally had it. I folded my hands and looked around the room. At the photographs on the walls. At the dining table where Robert and I had shared thousands of meals. At the home, everyone seemed so eager to manage on my behalf. Then I spoke. The money was never the lesson. Neither of them said anything. When people thought I had nothing, they treated me one way. When they learned the truth, they treated me another way. The money did not change. Only the behavior changed. Ethan lowered his eyes. Vanessa looked away. I was not angry anymore. That surprised even me. Anger requires energy. Grief requires energy. Carrying both becomes exhausting after a while. What remained now was something simpler. Understanding. Robert had known exactly what he was doing. He had not created a test. Life had done that on its own. He had simply recognized it before anyone else did. After lunch, we moved onto the back porch. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard. The maple tree swayed gently in the breeze, just as it had for years. For several minutes, nobody spoke. Then Ethan smiled faintly. Dad always seemed to know people better than the rest of us. I smiled too. Yes, he usually did. As the day came to an end, they prepared to leave. Vanessa hugged me before walking to the car. Ethan lingered for a moment longer. Are we going to be okay? He asked quietly. I thought about the question before answering. Relationships are not repaired by apologies alone. Trust returns slowly, sometimes very slowly, but families move forward one choice at a time. That depends on what happens next, I said gently. He nodded, understanding exactly what I meant. After they left, I remained on the porch watching the sunset. The sky turned shades of orange and gold, the same colors Robert loved. For the first time since losing him, I felt something close to peace. Not because of legal documents. Not because of assets. Not because of $28 million. Those things were never the real inheritance. The real inheritance was the lesson Robert left behind. Never measure your worth by what people think you own. Measure it by who remains respectful when they believe you have nothing at all. As darkness settled across the yard, I looked toward the horizon and smiled. Robert had been right. In the end, the truth always arrives. And when it does, it tells you everything you need to know.